Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to lesson 6. So, lesson 5 we ended with a really interesting quote from Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, about exactly who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So today we're going to carry on with that discussion along with a number of other quotes of the fundamental aqidah. We've dealt with about 8 points. So I just want to start off with another quote from Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, to complete the point that we were making yesterday on point 8. So he says, وَلِقَاءُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى لِأَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ حَقٌّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's meeting with the people of paradise is a truth, is a reality. How exactly will he meet with Allah? If Allah is so transcendent and above and different, then how is he going to meet with people? So he says, بِلَا كَيْفِيَةٍ وَلَا تَشْبِيهٍ وَلَا جِهَةٍ. Right? So just in case that question arises for somebody, he says it's going to be without a howness, meaning when we can't understand that right now, and it's going to happen then in some way or the other without a howness, without any kind of resemblance to how humans meet, and without any kind of direction. Because when you meet somebody, you expect that you're going to be in front of them. He says, no, don't think about any of these. You will meet him, but how you will meet him, we'll leave that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was then asked that, أَرَأَيْتَ لَوْ قِيلَ, like, what do you think if a question arose that where is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? If a question arose as to where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, then what would you say to that? So then he responded, he said, يُقَالُ لَهُ, the response would be that كَانَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى وَلَا مَكَانٍ. Allah was existent, right? And there was no place. Place hadn't been created yet. قَبْلَ أَنْ يَخْلُقَ الْخَلْقِ, meaning before he created creation, there was no thing as space or place, right? But Allah was there, right? وَكَانَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى وَلَمْ يَكُنْ أَيْنَ, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was existent and present, and there was no concept of where, right? That concept is a very human concept. Likewise, وَلَا خَلْقٍ, and there was no creation. وَخَلَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, then he created literally everything. وَهُوَ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, and he's the creator of everything. So he's the creator of space. He can't be attributed to space himself, right? I don't know why anybody would insist on Allah having a space anyway, what they get out of it, to be honest. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in a space, and neither does he need a space. And he was always there from eternity, and there was no space. And now he says that he is whatever he was always, where he was always, that's where he is today, right? That is where he is today. Right, so to move on with that, I'm just going to quote to you At-Tamimi rahimahullah, who is one of the, you can say, transmitters of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Aqidah. And look what he says. He says something very, very similar. He says, وَاللَّهُ تَعَالَى لَمْ يَلْحَقُهُ تَغَيُّرْ وَلَا تَبَدُّلْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never affected, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never affected by change or alteration. وَلَا يَلْحَقُهُ الْحُدُودِ قَبْلَ خَلْقِ الْعَرْشِ. And neither was neither was he limited by any kind of boundaries, right? Before he created the arsh. وَلَا بَعْدَ خَلْقِ الْعَرْشِ, and neither after creating the arsh is the same. That's why I really like what Imam Abu Hanifa said earlier, right? That فَقَدْ كَانَ فِي الْأَزَلِ وَلَا مَكَانٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was present in pre-eternity when there was no space. And وَهُوَ الْآنَ عَلَى مَا عَلَيْهِ كَانَ. And now he is exactly where he was before, meaning he is right now what he was before. So you can't attribute space after he created space to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he's beyond space. Okay, so that was completion of point 8. Let's move on to point 9 with regards to the fundamental attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So point 9 goes like this, that anything that you would conceive of in your mind, right? And usually human beings conceive of objects that have a length, a breadth, a depth, for example, colors, right? Characteristics like that. Various different states, right? That's how we conceive of things, right? So what we have to do for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is that we have to consider that Allah is beyond that. Allah is way beyond that. That means he's not limited, he's not with a certain color, etc., etc. No length and breadth and width and so on. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create what He wants. So that's point number 9, right? That to think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beyond anything that you can actually think of, which means that it's inconceivable to think of Allah's essence and entity of what exactly they are. You can't comprehend it. You can't. لا تدرك الأبصار ويدرك الأبصار. You can't even comprehend Him in sight, in vision. Forget about comprehending His reality. That's very. We just know enough about Him to love Him and cherish Him and worship Him. Okay, let's move on to number 10. I hope you're following, right? Number 10. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also free. And again, these are just going into a bit more detail. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free of any kind of howness. Like, how is He? Exactly, what kind of description. Likewise, any kind of number. And where is Allah? None of that attributes, none of that applies to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the only way you can attribute these things to anyone or anything is when it has similarities. Then you can have a relative understanding by comparison. But where there's nothing to compare to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then He's going to be beyond. There's nothing similar that you can compare. There's no competition. There's nothing of similarity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then you can't say kayfa huwa, because if you can't understand Allah directly, usually if we can't understand something, then we say, oh, it's like this. So for example, if somebody is trying to describe a certain fruit, for example, right, those of you who may have consumed durian, if you've been to some of these Far East countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand or whatever, right, you may have had a fruit called durian. Now some people like it, some people absolutely hate it. If you were to describe that to somebody who's never had it, how are you going to describe it? You're going to say, oh, it's a bit like, for example, a jackfruit, right? It's got very rough skin. You can conceive of all of these things because you've seen these things before. It's very soft. It's like custard, but it has this really, really smelly, really smelly kind of flavor to it. And you'll try to come out with a description for that by comparative products that have some kind of similarity or would take you closer, maybe 50, 60, 70% of the way to understanding it, right? That's what we do. There's nothing that comes remotely close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even for us to use that to try to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why you can't just say that. That's why it is not possible in our Aqidah to say kayfa huwa, how is He, right? So anybody who doesn't have anything similar, you can't say how he is, because you've got nothing to express Him with, explain Him and describe Him with. Likewise, anybody who doesn't have a number, then you can't say how many is He, right? So number, you might say, well, He is one, that's a number. Well, it is a number in that sense, but that doesn't do it justice. So when they say that Allah is one, it doesn't mean in number, it means His uniqueness, that He is totally unique and there's nothing like unto Him. That is the more stronger way of saying that, and say, oh, Allah is one, there's no second, which goes to kind of which implies that there could be a second, but there just isn't. No, there can't be a second. That's why the number that cannot be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can't say Allah is one in terms of number, because then you give the idea and imply that there could be a 2 or 3. No, it's impossibility, it's an inconceivability. Allah is a unique essence, right, that there can't be anything similar to. So that's why you can't even attribute number to Him as in one. When we do say one and Qul huwallahu ahad, it means He's totally unique, right? That's the real meaning of that. Likewise, anybody that doesn't have a beginning, then you can't say that when did He come about, because there is no beginning. He's always been there. And anybody who doesn't have a place, then you can't say where was He, right? He is where, the simplest way for us to respond is He is where He's always been. Although that gives an idea that He has a place, but it's just the limited way that we can say there's no change. He doesn't occupy. Okay, where is He, brothers? We need to know. Like children might ask you. I've always used the fact that, oh, He is where He's always been. We don't know what that is. We don't know how that is. But whatever it is, because we know Allah exists, but we don't want to attribute makan and place to Him. So we just say, He was as He is today, right? And that's it. That's a way to say it without attributing any kind of place to him. Let's move on to number 11. Anna ilmahu subhanahu. We talk about his knowledge now, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge encompasses every single thing that can be known and that there is to know. Nobody in humanity has that kind of ability. However, Allah, his knowledge encompasses everything knowable, right? Everything that comes in the category of knowable, Allah knows it. Likewise, his capability, his ability, right, to do whatever he wants, encompasses every single thing that comes within capability, that can be done, that is within the realm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ability. His will encompasses everything that can be willed, right, which is everything, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now putting all of this together, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew everything from the way it was, and then he intended it to become what he knew it would become. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends anything else to not be based on the knowledge of how he knew that it was not going to be. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from pre-eternity knew that you and I would be having this conversation today. You'd be taking this course today. I'd be teaching this course today. From before I was even born, from before Adam alayhi salam was born. And there are multiple other things that could be happening at this time. So for example, you taking this course right now, you're listening to me. You could have been doing multiple, nearly infinite other things. But Allah knew that that was not going to happen. And he willed it not to happen. I think that gives an understanding. Because nothing happens in creation, in the kingdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything is within the kingdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not intend. Nothing can happen. Nothing can happen. This isn't like in the case of, a powerful ruler or king or president or whatever who has control over everything. Still something happens. There's always something that gets through. There's always some loopholes. There's always something like that. No. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are no loopholes. There are no open barriers. There are no breaches or violations. Nothing can happen within what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers his kingdom, which is everything, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's kingdom. So nothing else happens in that. He is absolutely in full control, that no human can ever be like that. Now we move on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech. Now this one is a bit more difficult usually for people to understand. For human beings, speech is what I say, right? Usually what I say. However, speech has to be looked at in a bit more deeper sense. What I say usually comes from what's inside me, what I've considered, what I've thought about, and that's then is what I articulate. So true speech is what's in the mind, because usually we're not talking about people who babble along and don't know what they're talking about. We're talking about rational human beings who say things that make sense, all right? So what we say and what makes sense is articulating what's in our mind. So the real source of our speech is actually in our heart and mind, right? It's in ourselves. It's an internal aspect. Now, our speech internally is not characterized by certain words. So for example, unless you're actually preparing a very specifically worded speech or statement, you don't think in words. You think in figures. You think in forms. So for example, if I know that I'm going to meet with somebody and I'm going to have an interaction with him and so on, right? I'm usually going to think of the interaction, right, as a movie, as a scenario in my mind. And then after that, unless I'm actually going to prepare a statement to make and go over it in my mind and rehearse it, then usually there's no words. So we think and speak in our mind without words, but when we articulate it for it to be heard and transmitted and conveyed to somebody else, then obviously it takes on the figure of letters and sounds and words and so on, right? But that, what it does is we're just articulating what's in our heart. So now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech, for example, the Quran, right, is pre-eternal. It's always been there. Yes, it came down to us 1400 and something years ago, and the Torah came, this many thousand years ago, 3000 something, few hundred years ago. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech, which the Torah and the Quran and the Evangel represent, has been from pre-eternity. And it's now this is where it gets a bit complicated. It's a singular speech. It's not made up of words and letters and so on in terms of its original form, the original archetype of that. Like I said, what I'm saying right now is something that's in my mind first, right? Usually. So what's in the mind is without any kind of form or letters or sounds or whatever the case is. So Allah's speech is one attribute, one singular attribute. But it obviously consists, and when it's articulated, consists of commands, prohibitions. It consists of information. It consists of questions. It's everything. So, for example, the Bible, the Evangel, was originally in Aramaic. The Torah was in some kind of Hebrew. The Quran was originally revealed in Arabic, right? All of that is just a representation in those languages of the original speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is his divine archetype. The Quran and the Torah, etc., the way they were revealed in the world, in terms of their physical, letters and words and sounds, that is not the pre-eternal speech of Allah. And I'm just saying this just to explain this, all right? Is not the pre-eternal speech of Allah, because the pre-eternal speech of Allah does not need letters and sounds and so on, right? That is just a singular entity in that sense. But then it was articulated into the various different host nations of where those scriptures were sent in Arabic, Hebrew, and so on and so forth. And that accurately represented Allah's divine archetype. And yes, these words have also been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're created to denote the original archetype speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in all of these different languages that they come out to be in, whether that be Hebrew or Arabic or Syriac or whatever it was, they're all articulations indicating towards the substance of Allah's divine speech, right? In fact, even if multiple scriptures, like hundreds of these scriptures, were to have been revealed, they would never have been able to encompass the entire speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because no speech of Allah subhanahu the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be fully encompassed and articulated by any speech in this world fully. Yes, there's enough of it to guide us, right? There's enough of it to guide us. Just like all that is encompassed by the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can never be put onto paper. For example, it's just vastly way beyond that. Now you might think, where are you getting all of this from? Well, let's look at a verse in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 109, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا لِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي لَنَفِدَ الْبَحْرُ قَبْلَ أَن تَنفَدَ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّي وَلَوْ جِئْنَا بِمِثْلِهِ مَدَدًا. Had the oceans been ink to inscribe the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of the oceans, all of the water in the various different seas and oceans would be depleted before the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could be depleted, even if we were to bring in extension and in addition multiple others in addition, multiple other amounts of water and bodies of water, we would not be able to encompass that, because that is the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not responsible for understanding that, what exactly that is, as long as we understand the Quran and we take the Quran and we believe in the Quran. That's essentially what's important for us. So that was about the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, essentially saying that what Allah has revealed to us, like the Quran in Arabic, is a special wording, is special speech from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it is his created speech that represents his divine archetypal speech, which is without words, letters, or sound. When we utter it, when we write it, when we speak it, we are basically articulating something that indicates towards his speech. Hopefully that's understood. We'll look at that a bit more later when we actually cover the point. Again, here we're just covering the fundamental points, which will then make it easy for us when we cover the book, inshallah, and the text itself. Let's move on to point number 13. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, this is now moving on to a slightly different point, that whatever Allah does, he does independently. He does within his own creation, within his own possession, within his own ownership. That's why he can't be questioned as to whatever he does and what he doesn't do. Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you give me a child? Why doesn't God give me a child? Why don't I get that job? Why can't I buy that? Why can't I marry so-and-so? Or why did this happen to me? Why does this happen to my children? Why can't it happen to someone else? There can't be any objection at all, right? So it says, لا يقال فيما فعله لما فعله. That's what the text say. That anything that Allah does, you can't say, why did he do that? ولا فيما تركه لما تركه. Or anything that he does not do, why did he not do that? That is something that is not, because there's no freedom of speech in that sense, right? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just silliness. For us to say, why can't we say that? Why can't we object? Why can't we question Allah? Right? That is something that would be really crazy to do, just because we live in that kind of false reality in this world where we think we can say what we have and everybody's got that slogan going and so on. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's the absolute creator, and you don't like it, there's nothing you can do about it. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. There's nothing, nobody you can go and complain to. So Allah is beautiful. That's why get on the right side, understand that beauty and that elegance, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine, right? The only reason you'd have even these questions is because, you know, you're just buying into some other kind of narrative. Subhanallah. Okay, let's move on to number 14, right? Before we finish this part of the session. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolutely wise in everything he does. He does it with full wisdom. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly what his consequences is going to be. He knows exactly how it's going to affect everybody else around that person. We're living in a quantum world, so anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does has repercussions, right? Whether we realize it or not, it has repercussions on somebody else, right? And the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom in whatever he does is in absolute accordance, and he knows exactly what that's going to be. He never does anything by chance. He doesn't risk anything. He doesn't do anything without knowing exactly what the consequences are going to be 100%. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, also it's impossible for him to have any kind of oppression in his attributes, right? And because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not administering in anything other than his own kingdom. So when you want to do whatever you want to do in whatever you own, you can't be an oppressor in that regard. I'll give you a basic example to understand how things are, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks after the entire universe, and sometimes we ask him for certain things, all right? And we think, why doesn't he give it to us? It's so unique to me, or it's so particular to me, it's so personal to me. No. Anything that happens to us is going to have some repercussion on somebody else. For example, let's just get something simple, that if I get a new car, okay, and I put it outside my house, or I put it in my garage, right? There's no way that if I'm going to have a car that I can hide it from everybody. There's no point, right? It's not a collector's item where I get something in the dead of night, all covered up, put it in my house and just live. I mean, usually you get a car to drive around. So I've got it parked outside or in my garage. Now I've got 10 neighbors, right, or more. Now imagine, and I think that it's my car. What's anybody got to do with this, right? So I think I can be totally independent. We can never be totally independent. One of my neighbors is going to think, mashallah, I'm so happy for this guy that he's got a new car finally, right? Another guy is going to say, oh, what a beautiful color. That inspires me. That's a really nice color. I never thought it could be so nice. Number 3, that's a really good model, right? I never thought that, you know, that's a really good car. He'll come and ask me, like, how is it, and so on. Another one is going to get jealous, maybe. Allah protect, right? So why does he get that car? Why can't I get a car, or something like that? Another one is going to say, I don't like that car. I'm not going to get that car. Why did he get that kind of color? Right? Oh, great. He's got a car. Maybe I can ask him for a ride sometimes. Maybe you can see that everybody is going to have a reaction to that, right? Everybody's going to have a reaction to that. Nothing in this world happens without a reaction, right? Without a reaction of some sort or the other. That's the nature of the world we live in. Now, because everything has a reaction, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes care, and He can actually keep in control, and He knows exactly, He never loses any of the ends. He knows exactly what He's doing and what that repercussion is going to be. 100 people down, subhanallah, 100 people down, right? Okay, let's move on to the next point after this point about the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He does. Point 15 is, let's move on to prophets now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants people to know and do the right thing, right? And so He sends prophets as reminders and messengers. So He sends messengers, He also sends books. He clarifies punishment, He clarifies reward. That system of punishment and reward exists, right? Just as it exists in the world, whether we like it or not, right? We do certain things, we'll be rewarded somehow, whether by a thanks or an appreciation. We do something another way, somebody's going to swear at us, think bad of us, or whatever. At the end of the day, we can't escape this institution in this world. It's part and parcel of how people are going to react positively, negatively to what we do, all right? Then what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did to strengthen the prophets and the messengers is that He gave them certain mu'jizat, right? Miracles, extraordinary feats, so that people would look at it and say, wow, this guy must be special, this person must be special. And what He says, what they're saying, what these messengers are saying must be truthful, right? Then what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the messengers do is to speak about monotheism, speak about oneness of Allah, to take people away from all of the false deities and the false pursuits and the artificial pursuits that they have and the endless redundant pursuits they have. So everything that a prophet will say must be the truth, because if a prophet can lie or say the untruth, then what's the point of the prophet? So that is something which is vouchsafed, divinely protected, that prophets are infallible, right? That is our belief, right? That's a very fundamental belief, that all prophets are infallible, because if falsehood was possible, then it would be counterproductive, right? It'll be counterproductive. So that's why we believe that everything prophets say has to be nothing but the truth, and they can't lie. Right, let's move on to the next point, number 16, is that ijma' and consensus of the ummah on, the majority of the ummah agreeing to something, especially the scholars and the knowledgeable people, that must be the truth in some way or the other. That must be the truth, right? So an ijma', which means an absolute consensus, has to be the truth. That is another thing which is very important for us to understand, because not everything is found in detail, in that particular detail, in the Quran and Sunnah. That's why from the time of the Sahaba, Umar radiallahu anhu and so on, they got together, consulted and agreed on a certain thing based on what they knew of the Quran and Sunnah, and those things become definitive as well. Okay, we can discuss that later. Now, Imam Abu al-Muzaffar al-Isfirayini, who died in 471 Hijri, after mentioning the tenets of faith in his treatise, right, and the tenets of faith that he discusses are essentially those that Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah agree upon, right? And these are the 16 or so points that we have just discussed. These are agreed upon points, right? And pretty much most of it is covered in here. He says, وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ جَمِيعَ مَا ذَكَرْنَاهُ, everything that we know, that everything we have discussed, مِنْ اعْتِقَادِ أَهْلِ السُّنَّةِ وَالْجَمَاعَةِ, from the beliefs of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, فَلَا خِلَافَ فِي شَيْءٍ مِنْهُ, there's no difference of opinion in there. بين الشافعي وأبي حنيفة رحمهم الله, between the two Imams Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i, وجميع أهل الرأي والحديث, likewise everybody of opinion and hadith, everybody agrees with all of this. And then he gives the names. Okay, he gives the names. He says, now remember, this person dies in 471, way before, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, and many of the others today that you can say have issues with some of this, right? is very early on, 471 Hijri. He says that this is the agreed upon point between the likes of Imam Malik, Imam Awza'i. And these are all, you can say, 2nd century, right? Late 1st to 2nd century, you can say, right? Dawood al-Zahiri, Layth ibn Sa'ad, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, that's now going into the 200s, Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, great muhaddithin, Yahya ibn Ma'in, Ishaq ibn Rahuya, or Rahway, Muhammad ibn Ishaq al-Hanzali, Muhammad ibn Aslam al-Tusi, Yahya ibn Yahya, Hussein ibn al-Fadl al-Bajali, Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, Imam Zufar, and Imam Abu Thawr. I mean, these are the greatest of the early two centuries that we have, right? The 1st and 2nd century, the 2nd and 3rd century. These are the great people of that time. He says there's no difference of opinion in all of these points between the Imams of the Hijaz, which is the western border of Arabia, of Sham, which is the Levant, Iraq, the Imams of Khurasan and Transoxiana, the land beyond the Amudarya, which is Uzbekistan and those areas today, and anybody that came before them of the Sahaba and Tabi'een and the successors of the Tabi'een. This is pretty much what, so that is how he summarizes all of these i'tiqadat, right? So Imam, now what we're going to move into is, I want to, as I said, what I was going to do is I was going to bring you some quotes from the great Hanbali scholars as well, because as I said, that they don't necessarily consider themselves to be Ash'ari, however they espouse the exact same opinions. So I'm going to quote to you from a number of Hanbali Imams, all right, after Imam, including statements from Imam Ahmad, the Imam himself, right, and tell me the so many points that we covered. See if there's any contradiction to any of these points that we are going to look at right now. Okay, so that's what we're going to. I'm going to start off right with this, and I'm going to continue this for the next session as well, inshallah. So, for example, one of the first things that we'll take is the first point is the Ma'rifatullah. Okay, which was the first point above as well from the Ash'aris. Imam Ibn Hamdan al-Harrani, who's the Shaykh al-Hanabila, the Shaykh of the Hanbalis of his time. So he was from 603 Hijri to 695 Hijri. So that pretty much that whole century, right? He says, يجب معرفة الله شرعا بالنظر في الوجود والموجود. It is necessary to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, legally speaking, by investigating the wujud and the mawjud, which means existence. I think I've quoted this already. This was the quote I had down there. So this is necessary upon everybody who has the ability to do this, and it's the first wajib that they have intrinsically speaking. And the only way to get that understanding, he says, is by pondering over the creation, right? So that is why that becomes the first extrinsic necessity, is to ponder, becomes necessary so that you can know Allah, which is an intrinsic necessity. And he says then, فَمَنْ تَرَكَهُ, anybody who abandons this while having the ability to do so, without any excuse he abandons it, he will be sinful for doing that. Right, to summarize today's lesson, mashallah, I'm just going to give you a few more quotes, right, of the Hanbali scholars, all right, to show that they're exactly saying the same thing, right? So remember, we had another one of the points above, which is that we have to attribute all of the negating attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. So for example, they say that is the pre-eternal attribute, which is that Allah doesn't have a beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have an end, and he's always going to be there, and so on. So for example, Ibn Hamdan, about those things, he says, Ibn Hamdan is a Hanbali. He says, يجب الجزم بأنه تعالى واحد لا يتجزأ ولا ينقسم. So this is getting into good detail, right? You'll enjoy this. It is necessary to have full conviction and make a definite claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, which means, and again, not in number, but which means that he does not become parts, ولا ينقسم, and cannot be divided. أحد, he is the one, لا من عدد, but not in terms of number. فردٌ صمد, he is unique and self-subsisting. right? And majestic in that sense. لم يلد ولم يولد, does not beget nor is he begotten, and ولم يكن له كفوا أحد, doesn't have any body co-equal to him. لا مثل له, he has nobody similar to him. ولا شريك له في ملكه, and neither does he have any sharik, which means that neither does he have anybody who is a partner in his kingdom. وَلَا ظَهِيرَ فِي صُنْعِهِ, and neither in whatever he does he have any assistant. وَلَا مُعِينَ فِي خَلْقِهِ, neither does he have an assistant and a helper in terms of what he creates. وَأَنَّهُ شَيْءٌ لَا كَالْأَشْيَاء, and he is a thing like no other thing. This is exactly what Imam Abu Hanifa himself had said in his Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. حَيٌّ مَوْجُودٌ, he is alive and existent. قَدِيمٌ أَزَلِيٌّ, pre-eternal and everlasting. لا أول له ولا بداية, he doesn't have any beginning nor is there any beginning. باق أبدي, he is everlasting and forever. سرمدي دائم لا آخر له, and he will be enduring forever. There will be no end to him and there will be no limit to him, and he remains with all of his high attributes and his names from pre-eternity to now. He is fully there all the time, right? And this was, as I said, from Ibn Hamdan, from the Hanbali, called Ibn Hamdan rahimahullah, right? So inshallah we'll see you in the next lesson.